Welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. Today, we're pleased to welcome Peter Pomerantsev. Peter is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, author most recently of How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. He is also the distinguished winner of the Royal Society of Literature's Andante Prize, the Gordon Byrne Prize, European Press Prize, and shortlisted for many others. Peter, welcome to GovExperts Insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be talking specifically about Peter's work with the Reckoning Project, focused on the atrocities committed by Russia against the citizens, especially the children, of Ukraine, and exploring the role of propaganda in modern society. Peter, you were born in Kiev. Let's talk for a minute about your early life and background and kind of how that formed the basis for your professional work today.
Sure. So look, I was born in Kiev to a Ukrainian Jewish family in the bad old days of the Soviet Union in 1977. But my father was a dissident. He was arrested by the KGB for their heinous crime of giving his friends books to read, which in that day you got 9 years imprisonment for. Gives a little bit of context to our debates today in America about freedom of speech. But
what books did he give?
So, very good question. And actually an important question, because he gave Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which was the great Soviet chronicle of the system of prison camps, a copy of Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading, which is like a Kafkaesque story, but Nabokov was obviously an exiled Russian writer at that time in America, and so just having exiled writers was not good. And then a collection of essays about human rights. So what's interesting, though, is that, so it is important historically. So my father was a Russian-speaking writer. He was a writer as well, and the books he was giving out was in Russian. So he was arrested basically around human rights issues. His friends, who were Ukrainian nationalists, who were arrested under a different charge of nationalism and so on, they didn't get the choice. They were packed off to Mordovia, the last labor camp, straight away, the last political camp straight away. But if you were Russian speaking like my dad, you were actually a bit more privileged, and you're often given the choice of exile or prison. He chose exile like many in his generation did. But it's already a sort of like a signifier of how, in the Soviet Union, you were defined by the charge you were arrested by. So you were arrested for one charge, you had one set of chances of getting through. If you were arrested in a slightly different way, another one. And so I grew up in London. All I really had time to do was throw up over the Soviet Union as a toddler, and I was 9 months old when I left. So I grew up in London. My father worked at the BBC World Service and then at Radio Free Europe, where he was until last year, actually. So I kind of grew up on the fringes of the American project. Most of my family is here. And then, but I think my background has totally conditioned me to dwell on the modern battle between authoritarianism and freedom, on the role of art and literature in its competition with authoritarian propaganda, which in many ways my father was in the thick of that. And I suppose I grew up always thinking about what is the difference between, art and propaganda, which has sort of become one of the main themes in my work.
Interesting. Now, you write extensively about propaganda and the connection to identity. So what's your overall thesis on propaganda's role in shaping human identities?
Yeah, I've written 3 books now, all of them on propaganda. And the thing is, I'm not actually that interested in bots and trolls or posters. I'm actually interested because propaganda gives me a way to talk about who we are and when are we shaped by others and when do we choose to define ourselves, which is, I think, the most interesting issue to get into. When academics talk about propaganda, and I'm kind of an academic now at Johns Hopkins University, they kind of delineate between tactics, political propaganda, campaigns, active measures, the sort of stuff that we will talk about all the time, and what they often refer to as sociological propaganda, which is the stories we tell ourselves as a society to explain ourselves, to bind us into a community, but also to define who we are. And they can be positive stories, which are fruitful and very bountiful versions of identity, or they can be mean and nasty. In my last book, which is about Nazi propaganda, I looked at the formation of Nazi propaganda and how that capitalized on Germans' sense of disorientation in the 20s and 30s. People didn't know who they were anymore, socially, economically, historically. And what the Nazis did was gave people a very simplified idea of who they were. They were Aryans. They were superior to Untermenschen. They had a community they could all be part of, which allowed them to express some of their meanest feelings and legitimize them. So that's kind of the space that I'm fascinated by. Uh, I think we always, live in stories. And I think, there's actually nothing negative per se about the idea that we all need a kind of propaganda neutrally that brings us together. We all live inside of stories and inside communal identities. The question is, are they positive ones or are they nasty ones?
Do they need to be based in fact? Do they need to at least have been originated in fact?
Frankly, not only. Facts alone won't save us. But you're quite right in the sense that facts in sort of political discourse are kind of necessary when you're trying to build some sort of future. When you're saying, I want to achieve this thing, and here is my proof that I'm getting there, and you can investigate that proof. And so I think there are certain types of stories we tell ourselves that do need facts. So if you're building the American dream and you're building the Hoover Dam and you're doing all these great things, you're going to need facts to prove it. Yeah. If you're the Nazis and you're simply sort of recovering, the lost Valhalla of a completely mythical past, then facts will get in the way. So you'll throw them out of that discussion. So it all depends, the quality and the aim of the story will define how much it values evidence and facts and how much it needs, sort of checks and balances to be constantly investigating it. I think sort of, the liberal democratic story, we used to use those words uncontroversially, that was a story where facts played a huge role, where science played a huge role. So, that was very necessary.
So this is an interesting line of discussion and fascinating work that you're doing. Your connection to Ukraine and your interest in propaganda, is that kind of what sparked your interest in the overall issue, the attack on the Ukrainian identity, and how long has that gone on? Even predating probably Soviet Russia things. But talk about that connection a little bit.
Sure. I mean, my first book was actually about Russia. I lived in Moscow from 2001 2010, and I described in my first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, the growth of the Putin propaganda model. And that book actually ended with the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And since 2022, I've been very, very active trying to explain.
We've seen the propaganda that Russia has put out in the news that Ukraine, kind of a connection back to Nazism and others.
Mm.
For those, if we've gone through the public education system in the United States and we follow that, it's like, well, where did that come from? Things, but
Sure. Yes. I mean, the Kremlin will adapt different narratives to different audiences, and in that sense, they're tactically very, very adept. They look at what message will work and they try to fit that message to their audience. But in terms of like their vision of Ukraine, for them, it's not a real country and not a real identity. And they've been pursuing that since way before the Nazis. So since the 19th century, the Tsars would ban any attempts at Ukrainian sovereignty. They banned the language, they banned teaching in Ukrainian, performances in Ukrainian. They were constantly undermining any kind of attempts to form an independent Ukrainian national identity, let alone a state, obviously. And there was a brief independence at the start of the 20th century, and then the Soviets come in. They play a different game, They say, yes, you can have your kind of country, but what really matters is the Soviet identity. And that's actually written in Soviet law that, you can have your little Ukrainian statelet as long as you're loyal to the idea of Soviet identity. So you could be a Soviet Ukrainian, don't you dare be a democratic, independent Ukrainian. You get exterminated, and then obviously Stalin launches a vast campaign of extermination, killing around 5 million Ukrainians through starvation and murdering all the writers and intellectuals to destroy that. And now it's sort of, the Kremlin is really Putin is sort of pursuing the latest chapter of that. It's useful to call anybody the Kremlin doesn't like Nazis, because it's essentially using the term Nazis the way the Nazis use the term Jew. If you're a Nazi, therefore it's okay to bomb your cities, exterminate you, and treat you like a completely dehumanized thing. So that's that's where that narrative, its usefulness comes from. That's part of the story behind that.
What's your opinion right now on the Ukrainian identity? Is it
Uh,
stronger or weaker than times
yeah.
past?
So I did a lot of sociology in Ukraine between 2014 and 22. Firstly, it's a civic identity. So very, very few Ukrainians believe in an ethnic identity. I think under 4%. And it was always actually a sort of very comfortably multilingual country. That's hardened since the invasion, where language is used as part of the rationale for the invasion, and stripping Ukrainians of their right to speak Ukrainian in the occupied territory is a huge project in the invasion. So it's hardened. It's become much more linguistically proud. It's still a very multilingual country if you go there, but people have become much more sort of steadfast in their use of Ukrainian. I mean, look at President Zelensky. He was a Russian speaker until 2 years ago, basically, or 3 years ago. All his TV shows were in Russian. And he switched out of a point of principle. He's switched, and I know many people who've done that. So it's an identity that's become much more kind of culturally in a much more porcupine state. But still, look, if you go to Ukraine, it's a very multilingual country. Obviously, Ukrainian, Russian, Hungarian. It's still a very cosmopolitan country. It's been a place where many ethnicities have mixed over the centuries. But it's, when you're under attack, you obviously go into a bit of a crouch. That's sort of, that's very understandable. And, until really recently, relations and attitudes towards Russia were fairly positive. People were very skeptical about the completely unrealistic, but also occasionally discussed idea of NATO entry or EU entry. And obviously since 14 and 22, people are much, much more cognizant of the need to be inside of a network that would guarantee all types of security. So that's what happens when you get invaded. You get security conscience, and you get
It gets real quick, doesn't it?
Huh?
It gets real quick, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So with your focus on propaganda, let's talk about the Reckoning Project and how your past work kind of led you to working with lawyers, other journalists, data scientists, and activists that are focused on the war crimes that you see happen in Ukraine, that you're bringing attention to. You want some level of justice for things, but talk about how you came to the Reckoning Project and a little bit about it.
Sure. Look, at the start of I am a sort of an academic, but I also do a lot of media, and most of my academic focus is on understanding how do you create media that can cut through polarization and various types of barriers that people have to the truth. But when the war started, I felt that everything that I was doing just wasn't enough, and I was like, how can I take media and actually show that it's having an effect? And that's where the idea came from, to unite journalists and lawyers. So the journalists, we have between 12 and 24 Ukrainian journalists on the ground. They gather evidence of war crimes through testimonies. So it's in-depth interviews with witnesses and victims. And then that archive, which is very carefully curated by an archivist, is then used to create stories, which is what I think about. But then there's a team of lawyers in London who build cases, submissions to international treaty bodies, and do all sorts of legal things that is a much wider range of activities that I never ever knew about. So the idea is, how can we just have an effect? And the lawyers really, really appreciative of it, because it gives them both the evidence base, but also gives them, public attention to what they're working on. And it gives the journalists a sense that we're actually working towards an aim that is beyond just likes and shares and these kind of ineffable things that media is usually involved in.
And is the overall, I mean, obviously you've got focus on very horrendous crimes and the need for justice, but as a bigger picture too, things, are you dispelling propaganda that the Russians are putting out?
So look, again, it's very different markets and very different audiences. I think if you're on a kind of, well, look, some of the propaganda that's being put out is straight up denialism. So there is a sustained campaign starting from the Kremlin, but now repeated across the world, that Bucha, one of the most blatant atrocities in the war, was staged. Ridiculous stuff, but there are audiences that gets to. So that's kind of a long-term game, actually. There, it's really important to have the evidence base, the really deep evidence base that people can come to. Of course, you can chase audiences and try to debunk, and all that's important, but actually, it's very important to think long term, because that will grow and grow and grow. At the moment, it's sort of a niche thing to say that, but that can grow over time. And it's very important to think long term and to have this body of really deep evidence that can almost be like a monument to the truth. But then you have to think about audiences. And sort of my approach to propaganda is that, or to disinformation, whatever you want to call these kind of campaigns, is that they only work when they resonate with the audience in some way. So chasing after every lie is kind of impossible, tiring, and a bit of a fool's errand. You've got to work out why this is being said by who, and what is it they're trying to achieve. So we do a lot of social research, or polling, focus groups in different countries, trying to work out what matters to these people. Why should they even care about Russian war crimes in Ukraine? I mean, I do. There are countries like Poland where people do, but you go to Hungary, you go to Moldova, and people are very, very mixed. So you've got to really work out, why would a piece of disinformation resonate? Why would people be ready to listen to it? And whether it's then worth intervening. So that's a general rule of thumb. And different different issues connect with different audiences. So for example, we've done a lot of work in Argentina, which is a country that probably felt very far from the war, because it is very far. But when we went there and talked to journalists there about the use of torture in the war, we found a really strong connection, because people there had an experience of domestic torture, and we've opened up a case in Argentina around the use of torture. In bits of Africa, when my colleagues went there, again, it's not that there was a lot of Russian disinformation there, but frankly, people just didn't care very much. It wasn't their war. When we talked about the abduction of children, there was this really strong resonance, because there'd been a very similar experience with Boko Haram. So, often it's really understanding audiences, and you don't have to chase every lie. You will go mad chasing every lie. You have to really understand the audiences better than the other side, and engage people in a way that would be interesting to them. That's kind of my approach generally, and definitely on this issue as well.
Is it surprising to you when you see some of those propaganda, the disinformation reflected in some of the comments of other world leaders and things that, one day you can have like a narrative and, in regards to it. And then the next day after that comment, it kind of totally shifts. And then you've got a whole strain of comments that are questioning everything in regards to the U.S. position in Ukraine and various things. I mean, that's got to be disturbing things to see the impact of disinformation at that level.
It's incredibly disturbing, and it's disturbing because one feels that truth can be negotiable in a certain type of political discourse. I mean, my first book was all about this. It wasn't even about lies winning, because if a lie is winning, you can counter argument. Here's more evidence, and you can win that. Yeah. If people have got confused, you can win that. We're talking here about, truth being used in political discourse where it's not really about the facts. It's about power. Somebody is saying something in order to show, their power. So when Putin says, I don't know, Bucha didn't happen or something, it's not that it didn't happen. He's not confused. He's showing he doesn't care, and he is so powerful, he will be able to redefine reality and act in a way where the truth doesn't matter. So a lot of these things are about power, and there is a type of political discourse that has been around now for definitely for a decade, where truth is negotiable. It can be this, and then somebody has a different position, and they'll say something else. And that's very disorientating if you come from the reality-based community that people who research things
Frustrating.
come from. But it's very hard to compete with, and probably almost impossible to compete with, because it's not really about facts or evidence. It's about something else. So you have to think, I think, a little bit long term in that sense. You have to think about, how do we make sure that our archive is locked down? How do we make sure that there is, something beyond the madness and the reality show of politics? So that's very important. And I do think justice is very important. So it's almost like, I still think that most democracies and even non-democracies respect the courts eventually. And when you've been able to build up a body of evidence that gets through courts that people respect, then I think that that's also a very, very sort of strong anchor. This has been, it's not just like, I say that this massacre happened. We've collected the evidence. It's been to trial. Somebody was found guilty. That's a very important process. So yes. So again, it's kind of come back to my first point. It's about, you can't run after every lie, but can you generate conversations where the facts matter? And justice is one where the facts still matter. I hope for a while longer. It's in America, we see it now when the Supreme Court says something, for the moment, it still holds. It's still like a line.
Does the Reckoning Project draw lessons from, obviously, from World War II, the Holocaust, the denialism that has happened since then, things, and in terms of the body of evidence and what the monument that you're kind of establishing there, that's in a digital age, which, let's come into the digital age, but this is done in the digital age and will live on long after all of us are gone. But what lessons have you drawn from past, instances like that have informed the Reckoning Project's approach?
So the Reckoning was kind of built because we realized how shaky things are. I mean, more recently than the Holocaust, my colleagues have been in Yugoslavia, they were in Bosnia. And after Bosnia, journalists would be called to international courts 10 years later, 15 years later, when they're trying to establish the perpetrators of the many war crimes there. And they'd be asked, like, tell us what happened. And the journalists were like, this was 15 years ago. I've got an old notebook, which is like, decaying. I can't remember. I got some scribbled names of some witnesses. I can't remember. Like, this is ridiculous. So that's why we decided to actually train journalists to not just do stories, but collect evidence in a way that as they go through their normal storytelling work, because journalists are often the first on the scene, they're actually collecting a body of evidence that can be used for trials.
You're training them to inform history.
Yeah, well, we're training them literally to collect evidence in a way that is better than journalism and it's good enough for international legal processes. So instead of just asking, it's a question of detail. And it's like, instead of asking like, what did you see? You go, where were you? Where were you standing? What did you see first? It's just a level of, it's actually very similar to the journalistic process, but it's a level of granularity and a level of kind of getting 2 or 3 witnesses and not just one that is a bit deeper. I mean, it's not a million miles away from journalism. It's not a huge leap for them, but it's a discipline. And it's time as well. It means you spend a lot more time with people. Now, we're training them to collect evidence that will be good enough for legal processes, but definitely thinking about the future as well, to not repeat what happened in Yugoslavia, to not repeat what happened with the Yazidis. I mean, obviously, the Holocaust is in the background to everything anybody does because Nuremberg starts all of this off. But there's been more recent events that we've all lived through, Sierra Leone as well, and Rwanda, obviously, where atrocities were very poorly recorded. And it was a huge struggle to establish reality. So that's very important. But you said something here which made me think. And this is a question. So we're very much working in this paradigm of, journalism now, cases take a bit longer, and then history. But you said something about the digital age. Something that keeps me up at night is that we're just going to have dozens of versions of history depending on which virtual reality you live in. We have this thing that history will judge the complicit, that history will come finally, and there will be a judgment. Looking at the way the media environment is going, things just split up. You can live in such different realities. And again, I do wonder whether justice is one of the few things that connects it. Back to sort of Lincoln, the idea that justice is what holds a pluralistic society together, but also maybe, dozens of versions of reality together. But I don't have a solution to this. This is something that, I want to write about because it's so new.
It is an interesting phenomenon, and the things that you thought actually might have been put to bed in history bubble back up in ways that you would. And I've kind of come to the things like we say, we need to learn history so that we don't repeat it. I actually think that we're probably understand history so that we know that it's being repeated things, but there's not necessarily a way to forestall that things because we see it happening out there in multiple instances across the states here in the United States, but then across the world.
Oh, that's a very good point. At least we know that we're making a mistake. Yes. Yeah.
And I think we're kind of destined to argue about it. And in one sense, I think that can be healthy if it's informed with facts. I think the facts are woefully short, but that's why I think the Reckoning Project's activities are so important because you've got a mountain of facts that you're assembling there that's going to live on. And I wanted to ask too, just from how long have y'all been active now?
Since 22. So we started in the weeks after the full scale invasion.
So how's it going, and what are some of the successes?
So we were so firstly, we should say that this war, as opposed to Yugoslavia or Rwanda, is unique in that there are many people thinking about high quality evidence collection. We're not the only ones. I mean, we're the only ones who put lawyers and journalists together, but there are a few other big projects that are doing it. Some historical ones, some legal ones, some just general evidence ones. A lot of people think about, well, 2 or 3 people think about digital archives because this is unique. We're doing witness testimonies. Other people are collecting, every recording of where a shell fell on someone's phone, which is a vast exercise as well. So this war is unique in the way that evidence is being collected and cases are being built as the war happens. Usually cases come after the war. Nuremberg, obviously, but also Yugoslavia, Rwanda. So this is already unique. This was already a huge leap forward. That still seems too slow for the victims, obviously, because, they still feel violated and there's no grand accountability. But actually, this war is one of the most well organized in terms of data collection and case building ever. So that's
Would it be
already
safe to say that in past wars, it's about trying to find justice after the
yeah,
fact?
yeah,
And I
it's
would
usually
think
after
the
the fact.
victims today are looking for a remedy real time in some instances.
Exactly. There are cases being opened while the war happens. Usually it's afterwards. So that's already new and positive. In terms of the reckoning, so we've opened a case in Argentina. We've done multiple submissions to UN and treaty bodies. One of the topics that we opened up first, which is now a very well-known one, is about abducted children. I think we did the first very big story about that, about a kid that was taken from the occupied territories to Moscow and then managed to escape because his dad got him out. That's been a huge push. And obviously that's turned into many cases. There are 2 things that we're working on right now that I'm very excited about, and that is trying to define in legal terms what people might call brainwashing or indoctrination, which is a term that we kind of immediately have images of, I don't know, of Vietnamese camps or Maoist camps or stuff like that, or something from the Soviet times with communist youth groups. But it's actually something that's never been defined legally. So we kind of get it, we kind of know what it is, and people throw this word around, but no one has actually legally set out why is this a crime? Because you're not shooting anyone, you're not necessarily torturing them. And so what we've been doing is analyzing in a lot of depth what Russia is up to in the occupied territories. And I've been, very much focused on the storytelling part, on finding out the experiences of people. But then the lawyers have been thinking, okay, how do you define this legally? Because there is no one term. There is no like, I am taking you to court for indoctrinating someone. That doesn't exist. So you've got to break it down into little bits. Sometimes it's more human rights issues, freedom of expression. We're exploring a lot this idea of freedom of thought, which is a universal freedom, but has actually never been raised or used very much. There's the rights of the child that are being overruled. And then there's what Russia is also doing on the occupied territories is taking Ukrainian kids, pushing them into militarized youth groups, a lot like the Hitlerjugend, and then putting them into the Russian army to kill other Ukrainians. Now, that is definitely illegal. You're definitely not allowed to take people on occupied territories and put them into your army. So all these issues that we're looking at, and thinking about how you get some sort of accountability around that. And right now, actually, why I'm going to London and Brussels next week, have been working on the legal accountability of very specific type of disinformation, which is involved in the preparation of war crimes. Yeah. So I'm a big believer in, a very laissez-faire approach to freedom of speech, given my background in particular. But what we've really identified are these very, very precise disinfo ops that the military is doing before they bomb a hospital. So, for example, in the run up to bombing a hospital, they'll say, oh, there are Ukrainian soldiers there. Or in the run up to bombing a POW camp, they'll say, oh, the Ukrainians are about to do this, and then they do it themselves. So you can actually sort of identify the actors and you can tie it to a very specific crime. And then, there's questions about to what extent they're aiding and abetting a crime. So you start with the crime. It's not like the speech itself is naughty. It's actually the role of operations in war crimes, which I think is a way of thinking about, the delineation between free speech. I think things like hate speech are almost impossible to define. I don't think that's a very productive way to think about speech. This, which is a very clear and concise security service operation done by military professionals. So we work on that as well.
That's some fascinating work. So the issue of the children is one of the things I want to focus in a little on, because it's been one of the more horrifying aspects of what we've seen is Russia's large-scale kidnapping of children. Do you know a number of how many kids have been kidnapped and how it's happened? And
so there's two ways into this issue. One of them is children who are taken, sometimes from their families, sometimes from orphanages, and spirited away out of the occupied territories into Russia, where they're put into orphanages or given to foster parents. Look, the number that the Ukrainian government operates with is around 20,000, but really it's much, much higher. It's just very hard to track anything on the occupied territories. Also, you've got to understand Russia is not stupid. They're all saying we're removing these kids for their safety. They're in an orphanage near the front line, so we're removing them from their safety. That is perfectly legitimate. Yeah, anyone would do that. That's hard to argue with. The problem is, and the criminal bit starts, is when they don't immediately give them back. So what you're meant to do, you are allowed to move children from a bombing zone, but then it's completely your responsibility as a state, but also as the specific people involved, to inform the relatives where they are now, to do everything to get them back to their next of kin. You can't just disappear them, which is what happens. And so the numbers are very hard to track. Officially 20,000, probably much more. Now, and then they get sort of disappeared into Russia, and there's incredible work tracking them. We do it through witness statements, so often talking to the relatives who are looking for them or who saw what happened to them. Others will follow them online. Yeah, they'll do amazing with today's tools. You can follow. You can literally follow people on social media. Like, where is this kid now? With facial recognition, some do that. Yeah, so they'll take a face. They'll find the kid is now in Siberia. Or you do it through leaked databases. Yeah. So like, oh, suddenly, 10,000 new kids appeared in in this bit of Russia. Where did they come from? And trace it back. So there's different ways of doing that.
Well, I'm sure you've seen the recent reports about the United States withdrawing support for its tracking database and satellite imagery, helping to track these children. It may be just kind of a fog of war. But what's your understanding of the latest on that?
Well, look, there's a larger context that the US is, I suppose, in the name of opening up diplomatic channels, pulling back some of its accusations in the legal space around Russian leaders. So, they've pulled out of the group accusing Russia of starting a war of aggression and so on. Maybe there's a diplomatic logic there. It's not, it's
under the auspices that it makes it easier to get to, to be a credible broker between Russia and Ukraine.
If your government is working on a case against Putin starting a war of aggression, it's harder to talk to him, would be the logic. Whatever, that may be. But some of the best work on tracking the kids, and this is important not even for the cases, just to track them, just to know where they are, is being done by the Yale Observatory of Human Rights, which are an amazing group of open source researchers at Yale. And their program was cut a lot of panic in my sphere about the database. Where is the database that had all this information? That's all I know. I know actually as much as you. I am really hoping that all this is just, there's a lot of chaos at the moment in DC, with Doge kind of like slashing through institutions. And, I can't get my head around that somebody has done this maliciously. I mean, this is just the database. It could be
Yeah.
given to Europol, can give it to other researchers. Even if the US is no longer involved in case building, why would you destroy evidence on purpose? So I'm hoping that this is just something that's going to get cleared up.
I share that hope with you, Ellings. Kind of turning back, I mean, what do you think Putin's objective is with these kidnappings?
So yeah, this is where it gets interesting because look, we all focus very much on what's happening, on the agony of the relatives, which is quite right, and on the lives of the kids. But exactly why is Russia so obsessed with this? So here's where I think it's important to understand the scales that Russia works on. What they're involved in is a vast kind of re-engineering of Eurasia. They want to take a country of 40 million and change its identity. It's stuff that, stuff out of the 19th century, out of the 20th century, out of totalitarian thinking, out of Mao or Stalin saying, this nation moves over here, this nation I crush, We read about it in history books, and I think we sometimes can't get our heads around that somebody still thinks that way, but Putin does. So for him, this whole project is about crushing Ukraine. So how do you do that? One of the first things you do is break up families and take kids. That's what Mao would have done. That's what Stalin would have done. You take the children away, you re-educate them, you break families, because families are always the strongest unit that resists, this sort of totalitarian change. So it's worth to consider. The kids are one element of that. They're the easiest ones. They're often vulnerable kids. The parents might have gone missing in the fog of war, so you spirit them away. But then there are the 1.5 million kids who are still there. And they're the ones who are going through a very totalitarian approach to schooling, including militarization. If their parents try to, give them a Ukrainian education online or to preserve some of their cultural traditions, that's all taken away. The parents' rights are broken. The kids are sometimes taken away from them. So I think we have to understand the scale of what Putin is up to. He's moved in Crimea, 700,000 people have been moved into the peninsula and around 50,000 moved out. And it's vast social re-engineering. So Putin thinks big. He thinks like a totalitarian leader who can re-engineer really by his personal whim, not just the fate of individuals, but the identity and destiny of whole nations. Again, this is the sort of stuff we read about in the 20th century. It's just it even takes me a bit of a while to go, oh, that's what they're up to. But then it can make complete sense. I mean, that is the political tradition that they operate in, and that they grew up in, and which for them seems almost pragmatic.
So what's happening to those children in Russian custody today?
So the ones at 20,000, a lot of them were young. The ones that there are some that are amazing organizations like Save Ukraine, which is a heroic NGO, manages to get back. There's a kind of a underground railroad system that gets some of them back. I mean, I think managed to sort of get a few thousand back. Look, it all depends what age they were. If they were tiny, they've now spent 3 years living with a Russian family. They might not even understand who they were if they were very, very young. By the way, so one of the big stories that we did was about a whole orphanage of kids with disabilities, some of the mental disabilities. They were particularly vulnerable. They're really easy to kind of impress and change and manipulate. So some are used as propaganda toys, which is very, very alarming. So you'll see them on big parades where they express great thanks to the dear leader for giving them a new life. Others, we know through investigative journalists, play along with that, but desperately are trying to get home and will call friends and relatives in Ukraine saying, get me out. Some teenagers are very rebellious and they will try to make their way home. Sometimes, because there is an indictment to the International Criminal Court against Putin and his head of child affairs, sometimes if you give enough evidence in the international media, saying, look, we found these 5 kids, we found their relatives in Ukraine. They have relatives in Ukraine. There is someone to give them back to. We found the stories. You will then next day get a call from them from the Russian government. This has happened to some of our researchers say, oh, we had no idea. Take them. So
Wow.
sometimes they want to play nice. To go, well, us stealing children? Never. And they give them back. Usually they don't do that. Usually they'll find a million and one excuses not to do that. This is another reason why indictments and legal processes are important. Even if it doesn't get to the court case, just having that evidence there and the threat of a case can get the Russian government to respond in a certain way, because they don't want to be indicted everywhere. So they don't want to have cases everywhere. So they'll try to play nice. Look, what they're doing is very cosmetic. There's also some mediation from the Qataris, I think. They've got a little track getting kids out. So they will occasionally play nice, a bit like Hamas releasing hostages, have a few hostages, yeah, we're willing to negotiate. So they use as a tool as well. So all those things are happening. It's a very dynamic situation. So there's a diplomatic piece, there's a legal piece, and all of it's very live, and it's very important not to stop the research and not to stop the pressure.
So this work obviously is close to the heart of many families. For those, obviously, how many reunifications have happened? I mean, what's in response, and then how many are still waiting to hear something back?
So many more are waiting. Also, bear in mind, some of the kids are from orphanages. They didn't necessarily have immediate relatives. Others are waiting. I mean, I don't actually. This is embarrassing. Let me just check how many have been returned. I actually was looking at this morning for I think we're talking about just scores of children who've been returned home through an underground railroad. The ones who've been kind of spirited out. I think in terms of exchanged, it's I think 1,000 or so. But let me double check that before I get a number wrong and embarrass my whole organization
No,
for getting that wrong.
we appreciate your
Yeah.
confirmation.
I don't want to be fact checked.
What and what the children things, is there a legal term under treaty or international law that they're referred to? I mean, they're not prisoners of war. I mean, but what are they?
So they are well, officially they have been illegally deported. Some people use the word abducted, but it's sort of the illegal transfer of children. It's the physical bit that's important. So just so you understand where that sits legally, that's actually one of the signs of under the Genocide Convention. Because what you're doing there, it's part of destroying a nation. That's why. So that's the difference between the kids who are still there. So if the kids are in the occupied territories, that they don't fall under that. But if they've been physically transferred, the illegal physical transfer of children, then it falls under the Genocide Convention, because it's seen as part of a larger project of destroying the fabric of a people. And that's where it sits legally. It's a very serious crime. And that's why it went all the way to the International Court.
So we've been talking about propaganda, particularly propaganda in relation to the Ukraine war, the Reckoning Project, and propaganda has played such a huge role in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How have you seen the Russian propaganda change since the invasion began? What are they doing differently now than what they did when they started?
I think you have to understand with Russia, it's a very sophisticated propaganda system, which is, we'll choose different messages for different audiences, and that will select what works in a certain context. But certain themes are consistent. One is we're the victims. It's Russia who is the victim, and it's the evil West that forced this whole war. So that's been very consistent. I mean, that's a very classic one. Hitler conquered most of Europe, always saying that it was in self-defense. But that's a very, very consistent one that they come to again and again and again. The idea that this is NATO's fault. This is all a product of Western imperialism, that this is all America's fault, is something that works very well to audiences that have, their own bad history with Western imperialism. So it works very well in Africa, works very well in Latin America. For Europe, where you can't get away with that narrative, where Russia is clearly the aggressor, it's much more about, why should you care? This is a bunch of Slavs murdering each other. You always let us do this. Why don't you just go back to your cheap gas? Look how your energy prices have jumped since you sanctioned us. It's bad for you. we're not going to invade you. Don't worry. We just have, we just got to show these little pesky Ukrainians a lesson, but you don't like them very much either. It's much that sort of thing. Like this is our business over here. Lavrov, the foreign minister, talks about this a lot. Don't get involved. This is our thing over here, which, I don't think that works very well, because at the same time, their propaganda is constantly sort of threatening other bits of Europe, and their domestic propaganda is, and it's very hard to convince Poles and Lithuanians and Swedes that Russia isn't a power set on greater imperialism. However, it does work in Italy, in Spain, countries that are far away, countries that don't actually feel an immediate sort of an immediate threat. They might well see Russia as a malign actor, but is it really worth higher energy prices? So they play on that. They'll play on those sorts of.
Do you see those strains influencing America's public thought?
Yes, all of these have started to bubble through in America quite actively. There's it's very surprising to sort of hear arguments that were only ever popular on the kind of like the far left globally and in America, that this is all America's fault, this is all because of NATO, suddenly bubbling through here, because they're very much arguments that make America the main culprit. So that's been a bit of a surprise to see that here. But overall, the idea that this isn't America's problem has always resonated here, because it is, unlike most of Europe, it really is very far away. So I think that's one that finds a ready audience, because there's a degree of truth in it, and that can feed into existing feelings about Europe not pulling its weight and Europe being a freeloader, and that then takes you into a very mainstream place, because that's a very mainstream argument. Again, look, I always come back to this, that this propaganda works when it resonates with something that's there already. Yeah. So this this feeling that America is having to carry too much of the burden, and why aren't those wealthy Germans dealing with this? That's not that's firstly a not unreasonable argument, and that can be exploited further and further. Yeah, so we are seeing some progress on that, but overall, polling shows people are pretty consistent that this is Russia's fault, that Russia is the aggressor, that Ukraine is the victim, that Russia has done a very bad thing. I think the debate in America is about what should America's role be, and what is the extent of America's responsibility and burden for any of this. That's kind of where the debate is, which is a different one,
Right.
And yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, this has been an absolutely very thought-provoking discussion. I appreciate your insights. Wanted to ask, as we kind of conclude, are there any final thoughts that you want to share with our folks that are joining?
Listen, I think I spent 4 years in America, and as I mentioned right at the start, I kind of grew up on the fringes of the American projects, in the sense that my parents grew up listening to Voice of America, and my father worked at Radio Free Europe, and I'm very fortunate to have been kind of a product of America's benign influence in Europe. And so I'm always kind of very, very thankful for America for that. And I just want Americans not to forget that what they've done in the world has incredible meaning for not just individuals, but for whole nations. You go to the Baltics, go to Poland, and people there really have always viewed America incredibly positively. And I just hope people understand that America's played this incredibly positive role in the world, and I hope it can still do that. And I actually have a lot of sympathy for the arguments that Europe should be doing a lot more, but just don't forget all the good things that you've done.
That's an excellent reminder of America's role within the world, and that it can be a tremendous force for good. So, Peter, thank you for those comments. Thank you for the insights. For those that have tuned in, you can follow Peter on social media, and his books, How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler, are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And Peter, I think you have a book there somewhere that you can.
I do. This is the British cover, which is a little bit more funky than the American one. It's very Monty Python-esque, and I really like it. The American one is nothing as exciting. I don't know why. I don't decide these things, but it is, believe it or not, a funny book at times, even though it is about the Nazis, because it's about a British operation to subvert Nazi propaganda, which was actually quite comedic at times. So I know that sounds weird, a kind of amusing book about Nazi Germany, but it is.
Well,
Mel Brooks meets, some big war movie.
yeah, that sounds fascinating, things, and look forward to delving into it. Encourage everyone to get a copy today. Everyone that's tuned in can stay informed by subscribing to the GovExperts Insights, where more deep dives into politics, policy, and strategy. And thank everyone for joining. We appreciate your time. And Peter, thank you. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.